My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan. I'm a political scientist from the University of Melbourne, where I work in animal-related research, and I read Anna's essay and got in contact with her, and we've been communicating, so it's a real honour, a real privilege to be here tonight to be part of this discussion. But of course, the person we're here to see tonight is Anna Krien. Anna is a writer of journalism, essays, fiction and poetry. Her work has been published in The Monthly, The Age, The Big Issue, The Best Australian Essays, The Best Australian Stories, Griffith Review, VoiceWorks, Going Down Swinging, Colours, can you remember all these? Frankie, and Dazed and Confused. Anna's debut book, Into the Woods, The Battle for Tasmania's Forest, won Premier's Literary Awards in both Victoria and Queensland in 2011 and was shortlisted for numerous others. Chloe Hooper had said of Into the Woods that Anna's intimate, urgent book pulsates with life and truth. And the same can be said of all her writing. So tonight we're going to be discussing Anna's latest work, which is of course the quarterly essay Us and Them on the importance of animals. And I might just mention from the outset that copies of the essay are available for sale tonight if you're interested, which of course you are. And so let's hear from Anna.
And a big thank you to Siobhan for stepping in.
My pleasure.
It was amazing timing, short timing, and I'm sure you'll be brilliant.
Thank you. Okay, well, Anna, can we start with a simple question? Why animals? Why this topic and why now?
Well, that was kind of a question that paralysed me quite often as I was writing the essay. There was, the quarterly essays, they're usually about China or American politics or something really big and old manny and quite serious. And I was going to write about animals and how much I love animals. And I thought, and I was wondering how I would go down actually in that canon. So it was nerve-wracking, but at the same time, I found a really incredible quote by Mary Midgley, who's a philosopher, and it was, just because people are silly about animals doesn't mean animals aren't important. And that really sort of powered me on, that quote, because it's not their fault that we're silly about animals and that we scoff at them and we think they're really funny and they're great caricatures and we watch them on YouTube. It's not their fault that we downplay them all the time, and they are actually really important, and so that kind of fueled me.
Do you detect a shifting community attitude towards animals? I mean, do you think your essay was particularly timely?
Yeah, there's definitely a zeitgeist. You go into a bookshop and there's every man writing about his relationship with his dog. There's numerous animal whisperers of certain, kinds, and there's definitely a zeitgeist, but whether it's taken seriously or whether sort of steps are actually taken to seriously consider our relationship with animals is another thing, as opposed to it just being, pop culture or a bit of merchandising. So it's a fragile zeitgeist, I think.
Yes. So, have you always considered yourself an animal person? In the essay you talk about childhood experiences, you and your family with animals. Have animals always been important to you?
Yeah, definitely. I had a very close relationship with my cat Tiger, so much that he gave me worms once. There's always animal stories in my life, and they're always told over the family table, and there's sort of part and parcel. You wonder if it's the animal that's important to you or the stories that you tell about the animal or the personality that you project onto them. And my mum, I remember she used to bring home these little green tree frogs from the fruiterers that sort of fell asleep with the bananas in Queensland and turned up in Melbourne, and fruiterers would just wash them down the drain. So Mum would bring them home and would have a green tree frog for a while. And so, there were always those little things that were happening that they were just part and parcel of our life. But, yeah.
But in this essay, you move beyond the relationship between humans and their companion animals, and you talk about live export, use of animals in research, hunting, and in order to do that you had to do quite a bit of research. Can you tell us why you chose those particular types of animal use?
Well, the Indonesian was obvious. That issue was incredible. Michelle Grattan, a veteran political writer, described Parliament as the most passionate she had seen in years after the Four Corners footage was released of cows being slaughtered in Indonesia. And I think that's pretty amazing in itself that, you've got... I mean, there's been a lot of issues in Parliament over the last few years, but it was cows that turned everything around, and you have MPs asking for conscious votes, and it was amazing, and it was partly really admirable, I think, that of Australians to be that feel that strongly about the slaughtering of an animal. But it was also, I think it was an interesting topic because it really did reveal our own inconsistencies, and we could only follow that thread so far before we quickly let go of it and went, actually, well, we're not going to really consider our own use of livestock. So I thought that was a really telling case study for our use of animals. I mean, it's easier to condemn Indonesia because they're them, not us, as opposed to looking at our own uses of cows. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you do turn it on to us. You do look at kangaroos and dingoes and other local issues, so you mix it up. Was that purposeful?
Yeah, I mean, the testing particularly was purposeful. I mean, that was kind of our dirty little secret because it was easy to condemn Indonesia. That footage was horrible and it was horrific. So to sort of turn it back on us was the testing. And, I think it's really interesting that we all seem to have a clause inside of us that's allowed, but that's not allowed. And Indonesia wasn't allowed, but when it comes to testing and, our own pharmaceuticals and our numerous illnesses that we have, that's okay. We can actually exploit a whole bunch of animals for that. So I think that was an interesting juxtaposition.
Mm. Well, you've mentioned the Indonesia case, and I was wondering, can you tell us something about how you felt when you saw the footage? Did you actually see it go live to air with on Four Corners, or did you pick it up a few days later?
No, I didn't watch it live to air. Right. I imagine a lot of people turned off. I watched it a few days later, and it was horrific. Has everyone watched the footage? Yes, no, yeah. It's not a fun night in. And I mean, and you do get a visceral sort of anger for what's going on, and you want to intervene, and you see these sort of vulnerable, bellowing creatures that are being gouged, and their tails are being broken, and their tendons are being slashed in order to get them down to be slashed, their throat to be slit. And that footage was horrific, but I kind of see myself as a bit of a media parasite in that I let people break the big stories and then I go wander around the wreckage and sort of go, okay, well, what's happening outside of that frame? So I was really keen to go to Indonesia and see how that happened. Was that cruelty, or was that a problem of equipment, or just typical third world country problems? So that was sort of what took me to Indonesia, to sort of, because it seemed like there was more to the story than what was going on.
Mm-hmm. In one part of the essay you recount that someone asked you about seeing an animal die and you had to stop to think whether you have actually seen an animal die. Yet in the essay it's clear that you did stand and watch animals being killed. Can you tell us something about what was required to get you through that, and what you learned? What was that experience like?
So for those of you who haven't read the essay, I went to Lampung, which is in Sumatra, to watch cows be slaughtered that night in a small abattoir, which was basically in a garage in the middle of a suburb. And it was about 11 p.m. They start slaughtering at night over there, because then the meat gets taken straight to a wet market where it's sold. And the man who was showing me around, who was really generous and an Australian man, and he was trying to be really open and transparent. So he picked me up from where I was staying, and we drove to this abattoir. And it was a really interesting night. I mean, at first, when I got there, there's all these boys and young men. And that's one of the really important point, that there were boys and young men, and they were small people, and they're sort of walking around, and all you could hear was this whisk, whisk, whisk of their knives being sharpened, and which is a good thing, because in the Four Corners footage there were blunt knives. So, and in this particular abattoir, the Australian man had put in stunners, because he had decided that in response to the ban, he'll only sell his cows to people who put in stunning equipment. So he put in $30,000 of equipment into this tiny garage, which only kills about 20 cows a night. So he was really trying his very hardest to do the right thing. So they're lining up the cows, these big Australian cows, which are about 5 times the size of Indonesian cows, which is an important thing to remember as well. And sort of shuffled one into a corral and then into a box, and then brought the stunner down on its head. And then she was stunned, and then the cage opened and out she flopped. And I don't know, I was trying to describe this the other night in Sydney, and this man in the audience was just looking at me going, "You're disgusting." Mm-hmm. But it was kind of a beautiful moment. This man stepped forward and slit its throat, and blood just poured out, and the corneas were checked, and the cow was dead. And then these 4 or 5 boys stepped forward and laid their hands on the cow just to keep it still. And I mean, I didn't know this about life. I think it's just because we're used to films and it's sort of bang, bang, you're dead. But it wasn't like that. So it was like watching life slowly exit a body, and you could sort of see first its legs started swimming, and then it's like the skin shimmered, and there was a moment I panicked. I was like, "Oh my God, it's still alive!" And Greg was like, "No, it's dead. It's dead." And then sort of finally, the last bit of life went through past its vocal cords, and just made a noise. And it was kind of beautiful. It wasn't horrific. I was expecting it to be horrific, but it wasn't.
But then at one point it did become
more
horrific?
Yeah. So 1, 2, 3 stuns all went well, and then the 4th cow didn't get stunned properly. And the gate opened, and the cow was standing up and sort of the cow's looking at the killing floor, and everyone in the killing floor was looking at the cow. And then the cow sort of slowly slides down the slope and lands on the killing floor. And there's just this silence, and then suddenly everyone's like, "Whoa!" Just ridiculous panic, and some people run one way, other people run the other way, the roller doors shut, and you can just see this cow slowly catching on that something's not right. I mean, all these undone bodies of cows are all around it, people unpacking the organs. And yeah, it became a game of cat and mouse, quite similar to the Four Corners footage. But you could see the problems. You could see that these Australian cows, they've been mustered in the wild. They don't have any human contact. Indonesian cows, you lead them into the floor, you tell them that you press them down, they lie down, and you cut their throat. Australian cows are like, "No, we don't do that. We're big, and we're going to bellow, and we're going to get the hell out of here." And I kind of got a little bit patriotic for Australian cows. I was like, "I love you, larrikin cows," but it was really horrible. And it was problematic because I was there, so they were, and you could just tell how animal welfare needs to be intuitive. It needs to be flexible. You can't so they were all saying, we stun, and they're trying to push it back up the slope to be stunned, which was, potentially going to break its legs on the way up. But for animal welfare, you're like, no, you've got to kill it immediately. Like, you can't prolong this. So it was just a ridiculous, awful situation of, a killing gone wrong. And the man who'd brought me there, I could see him looking at me, and I felt bad for him because, he was paying the price for transparency. And it was a mess, basically. It was a mess. Mm.
You spoke to a lot of people and you saw a lot of things, including this slaughter that you've just described. Can you say something about the transparency? I mean, how forthcoming were people? How willing were they to share information, to let you in and to let you see?
In Indonesia?
Well, Indonesia and elsewhere. I mean, animal research is an area where typically transparency isn't one of, the shining attributes that we see in the research community either. So, if you want to speak to both, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, Indonesia was... they had their guard up. A lot of people had their guard up because of the footage. But at the same time, it was Indonesia, Southeast Asia. I mean, it wasn't that hard to just appear at midnight and sort of talk your way through it. In Australia, bordering on impossible to get access into an abattoir because they know. Right. They know what it looks like to the outside eye.
Right.
So transparency in Australia is not good at all. And that's really interesting with a lot of these case studies that I looked at. It was always undercover footage that revealed what was going on in our name usually. And sort of revealing what was happening in laboratories or revealing what was happening in abattoirs. And there was footage released from a Gippsland abattoir last year which showed horrible things happening to pigs that aren't humane at all. If you can call, enslaving an animal for its entire life and then killing it humanely an okay thing, but to hide behind this idea of we stun, therefore we do the right thing, that doesn't actually necessarily happen either in our hometown.
So back to Indonesia, one of the themes that came out strongly in the essay for me was a very deep compassion towards humans as well as animals, and that's part of the puzzle that you're trying to address. And it was also, you actively expressed compassion for the situation that humans found themselves in. What do we do when the interests of humans and animals come into conflict? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, Indonesia was important case study for all of that because people would talk about if you're pro-animal, you must be anti-human, and there was Bob Catter, not that anyone takes him that seriously, but he was saying, people are going to starve if we ban the cows, and there were a lot of untruths going around surrounding that debate, because the truth is that only the top 10% of Indonesians, the wealthiest Indonesians, eat Australian beef, which is admittedly 22 million people, so it's a good market, but it's not the poor people. The only poor people who might be eating a bit of Australian beef are the workers who might get paid in a bit of fat, but that's all. So there were all those untruths going on, and there's no fridges in Indonesia. There's actually 60% of households in Indonesia have fridges. So that was sort of making the debate blurry. And then there was, there was a Malaysia solution going on in Australia of dealing with the asylum seekers. So that was, and the cows got more empathy than asylum seekers, which was incredible. But that's not to say that the cows wasn't an important issue. It's just that that's obviously what can access the Australian heart more than an asylum seeker. And when I was in Indonesia, it was really interesting because they were considering a ban of their own over there while I was there. But their ban involved, there were protests everywhere lobbying to to stop Indonesians sending workers to the Middle East because they were being mistreated in the Middle East. So they were considering a human ban while we were talking about a cow ban. And but then whenever that was mentioned, it was set up as if you care about cows, you can't care about humans, which is sort of why I wanted it to be us and them in the essay, not us or them, because it's an impossible debate. If it's us or them, of course we're going to choose us. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a no-brainer. So why can't it be us and them?
It's interesting though, because you say animals are what moves the Australians, and I think you use the expression access the Australian heart. Yet we still do terrible things to animals. How do you make sense of that distinction? You know, on one level we do care, and the other level we're all implicated in harming animals.
Yeah, I guess we're hypocrites, myself included. Yeah. And I think that's sort of one of my points, is that the debate needs to move on is our treatment of animals ethical or not? And it's not ethical. It's highly unethical how we treat animals. It's the question needs to be posed now is how much of this injustice can we cope with? How much will we tolerate? Because we're highly inconsistent. I mean, companion animals have rights to natural sunlight, have to have a certain amount of exercise, whereas livestock animals can only live in the same space as the size of their body and you never have to see the sun at all. So, I mean, we're incredibly inconsistent. Or in the science testing, I had one man say, well, it's just rats and mice for the most part, as if they were just apples and oranges. But where do we draw the line, and why do we think that some animals are better than others? And that's sort of why I think it's really interesting that usually when we do give an animal a bit of our respect, it's because they're a little bit like us.
Yes.
Which, you know, so the chimpanzees are looking at getting rights, but that's because they're sort of almost human.
Yes.
But why can't chimpanzees just be good at being chimpanzees?
Yes.
So
pays to be close to us in evolutionary terms.
Yeah.
And good looking as well. Pays to be good looking,
like cute eyes and stuff?
Exactly, okay. Yeah. All right. The poor old cockroach has not got the right PR people. Now I was going to ask you to read a section of your essay, which I think really flows on very nicely from what we were just discussing.
Yeah.
So just, where to start.
So this is in the chapter on testing. 3 years ago, a 31-year-old chimpanzee at a Swedish zoo was discovered to be collecting stones before the zoo's opening hours and storing them at various locations in his enclosure. He had also learnt to recognise weak parts of the concrete structure and had chipped away parts of it to add to his hidden piles of ammunitions. Hours later, when the zoo was crowded with visitors, the chimp would reappear, now furious and agitated, and throw the rocks at people. The strategising chimp was written up in Current Biology as part of a study that aimed to show that certain animals could anticipate a future mental state. The early morning planning, the secret stash of rocks, and the obsessive chipping away at his own structure for projectiles was evidence, concluded a cognitive scientist, that certain animals can plan for future events. I've no doubt that this particular chimp demonstrated all this, but would it be unreasonable to add that the chimpanzee was also extremely pissed off, bored, and didn't want to be in a zoo?
So... You address the issue of anthropomorphism. How do we deal with that? I mean, most of us aren't scientists or vets or animal behaviouralists. How do we know what's right or wrong when it comes to animals and how we treat them?
I don't know if I know the answer to that, but I do know that anthropomorphism is used as a kind of shut up don't say that, that's anthropomorphic. And it's used as a kind of defence when people do things to animals and someone says, do you think that's okay, or do you think it's enjoying this? And they say, well, don't be anthropomorphic. Don't talk like that, like you know what the animal's thinking or feeling. And science relies on that cold distance highly, heavily. And it also sort of, I'm assuming that study was trying to say what I said, but couldn't say it for some reason because of science newspeak or something, and just had to sort of do this sort of bizarre, it could plan for future events kind of thing. Whereas I do feel like there could possibly be a little bit of common sense brought back into the debate. And Kurt Sayer writes about it in Elizabeth Costello, where he describes this chimpanzee that's constantly being put through these intelligence tests of how to get the bananas, and so he's getting crates and he's moving rocks around and he's getting a stick and he's getting the bananas, and the scientist is going, oh, well, he's about as intelligent as a 1-year-old now, or as intelligent as a 2-year-old now, but Kurt Sayer's character Costello says, sure, he can do all these sort of intelligence test things for you, but ultimately, what's the chimp thinking is, why are you doing this to me? Why won't you give me my bananas? Why am I in this cage? Why can't I go home? And it just cuts through the bullshit. I mean, these animals can do as many tests as they want to do to prove how intelligent or unintelligent they are. But why can't they just be what they are? Why can't they just be what they were meant to be? A squid, who cares how smart it is in our eyes? Why can't it just be a squid? Mm-hmm. So, and it was just this beautiful sort of idea of all these tests done to show that rats have empathy and therefore they're a little bit like us, or mice can feel pain, or it's just really obvious things that seem to just reaffirm what science already knows. But we have to put it down in our own little hoity-toity language. Mm-hmm. And then we need someone else to do the same experiment to double-check, triple-check, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So we should give animals the benefit of the doubt, you think?
Well, I just don't understand. What do you mean by that?
Well, they don't need to prove themselves. I mean, unless we've got reason to believe otherwise, we should assume that they think and feel and care and their environment matters to them.
Yeah, and also, why do they have to do a test of humanity?
Right.
Why can't they do a test of chimpanzanity?
Right. Yes. That reminds me of another important issue, which is how we actually gain access to the animals and how we have a relationship with them that allows us to, form an opinion. A lot of our relationship with animals is mediated through experts. And as you'd be well aware, after being in Indonesia, animals are much more present than they are here. I mean, you probably know the Vic market was once a wet market, but of course it isn't anymore. Do you have any thoughts on how we deal with that? How do we come to know animals and care about animals ourselves if we're not in your position, say, researching and writing about it?
Well, there was this beautiful letter which I talk about in this essay, which is from a prisoner in an American prison, and he's in for life. And he wrote this letter to NPR radio station in America. And he was describing how an orange scruffy cat came into the prison yard and how it changed the atmosphere of the prison. Prisoners who never spoke started to sort of stand around the cat and sort of just started chatting. Other prisoners took it upon themselves to take the dreadlocks out of the cat's fur and pull the burrs and sort of get it back to a semi-okay looking state. Well, other prisoners stole food from the prison kitchen and they put saucers of milk under the dumpster so seagulls couldn't get it. So this little tiny cat changed the prison culture. And he was writing people always talk about what we need in prison. We need more rehab programs, we need, you know, better education, or we need people to love us, or we need better self-esteem. But he was saying what the cat taught me was that we need to learn how to be kind to something else. That's what changed us, and that's what changed us towards one another, because we were all mutually kind to the cat. And, you know, that didn't require an expert. That required a cat to just actually fall on its paws, you know, luck into this situation where it was treated like a queen. But that was a purely very basic situation that required no expertise, that changed men and changed their relationships to each other. So
did your values change during the process of writing this essay?
My values are always changing.
Right.
No, well, I don't know if they change so much as I don't like to judge people, and I never like it when, I mean, I hated when the Indonesian debate turned into the Indonesians are cruel, and I didn't want to go and seek out cruel people and say this is a cruel man. Or when I met a surgeon who did surgery on a baboon to look at organ donation from pigs to baboons, I wasn't there to judge him. I was there to understand his work and why this work is done in humanity's name. So I don't know if my values changed. I guess I just learnt more. Sometimes I think as the older I'll get, the less I'll be able to have an opinion, as opposed to when you're young and you have these really strong opinions. Yeah. But the more you talk and the more you research and the more you meet people and you see the complexities, it's hard to have a staunch opinion, which is why I always got scared of the question of are you a vegetarian or are you a vegan, because part of me thinks I know what I am, but people have such a strong visceral reaction to that and can turn off without even hearing what you have to say. And you know, and I've been getting emails from vegans saying, well, I don't understand where you're coming from, because there's only one way to be, and that's a vegan. But I personally don't think that's very useful to the debate, and I don't actually think it's pragmatic either. So have my values changed? Not sure. Maybe. I guess my friends and my family will tell me.
Excuse me. What has the response been?
I'm not sure. I mean, it hasn't been the essay hasn't had its a week in the press where, you know, it hasn't been a political essay or hasn't defined hasn't been definitive first week, 2 week essay. I think it's maybe a bit more slow. I've had a lot of emails. I think it's a bit of a different essay to the usual quarterly essays. I think it's not... I mean, I worry about the correspondence because I mean, it's not as if... I mean, it's the same with Into the Woods when I did that Tasmanian book I'm not setting myself up for a hit. I'm asking for a conversation. And a lot of people don't really know how to respond to that, because people want to punch. People want to say, you're wrong because of this. But that's not what I've set up. I've set up well, these are some issues and maybe that's a discussion worth having. So, yeah, I think maybe people don't necessarily know how to take that, and other people are really relieved that there's an essay that doesn't sort of entrench a certain view or a certain type of person.
You write towards the end of the essay, what I want to say is let's not kid ourselves. The injustice is complete. This is not a debate over whether our treatment of animals is unethical or not. It's unethical. We know this. what would it take for it to be ethical? Do you have some solutions or some ideas that you came across during the course of researching and writing the essay?
Well, the last chapter was on hunting, and that was a really fun chapter to write because it had a reconciliation moment. It had so basically I was looking at the role of the apex predator in the environment and looking at dingoes in Australia, and I'm not sure how much of you have read it or know about the apex predator, but there's been a lot of studies from America done on it, and Yellowstone National Park is a really good one for it because the wolves were exterminated around Yellowstone, and as a result the entire place was overrun with elk. And I just think that was a really it's really intuitive. You know that when you take a piece out of an ecology there's going to be a collapse of some sort, but this research reveals that when you take the top predator out there's an inevitable collapse of the entire system. So the elk overbred, they overfed everywhere because they were not threatened, so they went all around the area and ate the woods, ate the stream sides, ate everything. And then the makeshift dams by the beavers broke, the beavers disappeared, the birds disappeared. The coyote moved in. The coyote wasn't the top predator, so it couldn't get the elk, but managed to drive a couple other species to extinction. So basically the place was just crap land. It just went to ruin. And then the wolves were introduced, and the place came back to life, and it was incredible. Only problem is that humans aren't that happy about it, so there's bumper stickers all around saying, save 100 elk, kill a wolf. So there's this really interesting idea that humans just can't deal with living alongside a predator, even though we're not very good predators, obviously, because the elk were just taking complete control and were ruining the landscape. So people were applying that to Australia and looking at the dingo as a top predator and finding that wherever the dingoes are, threatened species are actually doing quite well. And the marla, which is a really interesting case study, which is like a cross between a hare and a wallaby. There were a couple colonies of marla in the Tanami Desert, and they were threatened. And the researchers, with good intentions, noticed that the dingo took a couple every now and then, so they got rid of all the dingoes. In a week, all the marla were gone. Because the foxes moved in. So there's this understanding that the top predator actually suppresses other sort of half-sized predators like foxes and cats. So that's just really sort of starting to be understood in Australia. Only problem is that rural people who run sheep don't want a dingo near their flock. And that's understandable. They wake up in the morning and there's sort of scattered bits of sheep everywhere. So that was a bit of a real impossible point where, the wild and the rural just wouldn't live alongside one another. And then in the last 10 years, Maremma sheepdogs have been introduced, these guardian animals. And they're from Europe, and they were used about 1,000 years ago when there were still predators left there. And now they're bringing them into America and Australia, and they're incredible. And dingoes are allowed to live alongside flocks because these sheepdogs don't really know how they work. They're bonded to the sheep. They think they're a sheep and they want to protect the flock, so they use the skills of a dog, which is incredible. And there was all these studies done. People thought that the dingoes just wouldn't come near the territory, but it turns out dingoes are actually passing through, but the Maremma sheepdogs are letting them as long as they behave. Yeah. And so these farmers are waking up, and every now and then they'll wake up and find all their livestock has been corralled into one paddock because something must have happened that night and all the dogs decided to get everyone packed into one place. So the farmers are like, great, getting a good night's sleep and don't even know what happened, but everyone's safe. So that's a beautiful reconciliation moment. And obviously, you could be a hardcore animal activist and say, well, look, we're still exploiting animals because we've got these Maremma sheepdogs and we're using them for our tools. But I just can't think like that. I just don't see it like that. I see it as we're actually exploiting one of the most talented aspects of a creature, and we're bringing that to fruition, and it's becoming a reconciliation animal between two worlds. So I mean, I don't know if that's an ethical place where we can go to, but it seems like it seems special to me. And I was really glad to discover it because there weren't a lot of things that were that special when I was doing my research.
Yeah, yes. Well, that's right. Complex problems. Yeah. Look, I think it's now time to hand over to the audience to have their go at asking you questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we just move back briefly to how you considered what was right and what was wrong, which got a bit mixed up there. Perhaps we could go to the bottom line and say that animals, all animals, no matter what they are other sentient beings. And therefore have the same nervous systems, very close to our DNA, etc., etc. And so obviously things like keeping pigs in cages where they can't get at their young is obviously wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why the Indonesian footage was really interesting, because basically what Australians saw was objects, which is what we treat cows like. We treat them as objects. And suddenly they became subjects. They were bellowing and they were sentient and they were feeling pain. And our reaction was really interesting because we thought, oh my God, we need to introduce humane stunning so that they can safely become objects again. So that was our reaction. That was our unanimous Australian reaction, was to how the hell do we make these subjects objects quickly, stat. So I think it's a really interesting, that's a really interesting way to go about it, and it seems to be a mainstream way to deal with that.
Okay.
So I'm not telling you what's right or what's wrong, I'm just saying it's interesting.
Yeah, I just think it's a good starting point. And incidentally, the Maremmas, I went to a free-range chook farm recently and they bond with the chooks, parade the perimeters at night time and keep the foxes at bay. So I think it's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Sorry, I'm just going to go to my notes.
Wow, you got notes.
Yep. Anal. I suppose I've just got a question on live export. 150 years ago, Americans would have thought you absurd if you advocated for the end of slavery. 100 years ago, they would have laughed at you for suggesting that women shouldn't have the right to vote. 50 years ago, they would loudly objected at the idea of African Americans receiving equal rights under the law. They laugh at us now for suggesting that animal slavery be ended. Someday they won't be laughing.
Well, yeah, I discussed that quite a lot in the essay, that the terminology and the rhetoric that's used to control the status of a person is the same in way we talk about animals. It was absurd to grant women rights and people were laughed out of court. Apparently the economy was going to collapse if we abolished slavery in America. The economy didn't collapse. And the same kind of arguments are used when we discuss the rights of animals, is that A, you're a crackpot, and B, it's a ridiculous notion, and how could you compare animals to humans? In the same way, how could you compare women to men? It's the same, I think it's the same situation, and it's a similar movement.
Yeah, and I suppose, you know, a good question is, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but rather can they suffer?
Yeah.
And they're sentient beings.
Definitely, and I guess that's similar with the chimps in the lavatory.
And I suppose that's why vegetarians and vegans are what they are.
I felt you were getting somewhere.
Guess which one
I was waiting for it. Yeah.
Next question. Yeah? Oh, we've got... Okay.
I haven't read your essay, so forgive me, Anna, if I'm talking about things that everyone else knows about. But it is a dilemma, and being an animal lover, I find it a huge dilemma, and I suppose a contradiction in most of our lives that, you know, we eat meat. Some of us eat meat. We buy cosmetics, clothes, etc., that are all a result of some animal testing along the way. But how do you resolve this dilemma with, perhaps Siobhan might like to comment as well, being attached to the uni, that, you know, is it always necessary to use animals for testing for the benefit of humans? And that sounds a horrible, callous thing as I say it, but do you know what I mean? Are there any other alternatives to this dilemma of we don't want to see animals suffer, of course, but, you know, perhaps, I'm not saying we turn a blind eye, but, you know, is it absolutely necessary that we do have to undergo these methods and testing procedures, etc., to be able to put meat on the table, to be able to advance medical research, etc., etc.? I mean, how do we resolve this?
Well, I mean, I'll describe one of the case studies and in the testing chapter I met a surgeon who transferred organs from a pig into a baboon, and that's a lot of testing is a lot less mundane. This was actually breakthrough medical testing going on, and the idea is that we have, you know, a pig that is like a portable suitcase of spare organs. And in order to test these organs out, we need primates, and obviously we won't do that because we're special. So we give baboons to do the job. And this surgeon was, you know, and he was an avid believer that he was doing the right thing for humanity. And, you know, you can imagine that it is. There's a huge need for organs. And if you had them harvested on the spot, like with a pig, you could actually, you know, give guarantees. You could make sure they're lined up at the same time as someone having an operation. So you could see the calculations. Except that on the other side of that conversation was, right, so we're going to go straight to using pigs for our spare organs. And I just felt like there hadn't been a discussion. Why isn't there a bigger organ campaign amongst humans? Why aren't we told to step up? Why don't we fulfil our own ethical obligations to one another before we use a whole new industry of animals? And the surgeon responded with, well, in China, there is a lot of stories of in death row, humans are used for organs, and a lot of Westerners go to China for transplant tourism. So that creates an unethical conundrum. And then there was another question, why can't we use embryos or stem cell research? That's definitely a possibility in America. Depends which way the vote swings, but there's a lot of issues with using sacred human embryos, which are 6 days old, in the name of science, and to potentially look at cloning organs. So there was this whole discussion that surgeon hadn't had because he wasn't discussing it with people outside his profession. He was discussing it within the industry, within the scientific profession. And sure, there are ethics committees, but they're very human-focused ethics committees. And I just didn't understand why, because we can't trust ourselves to be ethical, why an animal has to take our place. Why? Because we don't think we can trust one another to do the right thing, to donate our organs, to make sure no one is bullied into giving their organs. Why does the pig have to take the rap? So I'm not sure if there's a resolution, but I think there's definitely a need for a discussion and a sort of a change of where the ethics stands at the moment. I'm not sure if utilitarianism really actually sits that well with many people anymore. I'm not sure if you could actually say, look, we're going to torture 10 monkeys to save 100 people. I'm not sure if that would be as easily stomached as it might have been 50 years ago. I think that there is a change in the public's mood, and that needs to be recognised by ethics committees and by industries. So, not much of a resolution there, but do you have an answer to that?
Oh, look, I'm happy to chat after, but let's keep going with your points, Anna. Yeah, question up the back.
G'day. I just wanted to ask a question about your style. In your essays, you tend to write yourself in as a character. Could you tell me why that's important to you and why you use that as a method?
Because I'm in it. I mean, I would never... As a writer, you pick and choose when you feel like you might belong in the narrative. So I wouldn't use question if your position is relevant or if you can be helpful to the reader. And in this essay, I thought it would be good to have a guide. Plus, it's a very personal essay, even though there is a lot of journalism in it. It's a fine line. Sometimes it's really self-absorbed and arrogant for a writer to be in the essay all the time. But I don't know, I feel like I'm quite an uncertain person, and I feel like that might be, people might trust that as a narrator to go along with me and to feel guilty as I feel guilty, or to say the wrong thing or to do the wrong thing. I think that's something that people can trust and feel comfortable with, as opposed to a narrator that might be judging them or might be cold or authoritarian. Does that help?
Hi. Thanks for a great essay, first of all.
Thanks.
I have another question about the writing. Reading through the essay, you become aware that you must have been through an incredible amount of information, like regardless of going to Indonesia. Just the amount of research that you must have done to write the essay seems very vast. And I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about your research or your research techniques.
You should probably talk to my partner, actually. He's the one who has to live with it. Mildly obsessive, read everything, even things that are very, very precariously linked to the subject. Typing 24/7. Not very fun to live with, actually. I'm not really sure if I can answer that. It's kind of a bit patchworky, but I just absorb everything and then hope that my editor can help fish me out.
Yeah, another question?
One of the things I liked about the piece was the really broad scope you take, like not just looking at slaughterhouse practices and the ethics of eating, but also hunting and personal relationships. I think like a lot of essays would maybe look at one of those things, not all of them side by side. And I was wondering what, like, the genesis of the piece. Did you start with any one of these aspects and decide they all deserve to be looked at together?
I don't really understand that question. Can you soundbite that one? So did you think that was there a decision behind putting them all in the one place? Is that...
That is what I mean. I thought it was distinctive that you looked at all these things together, like you decided to take a kind of state of the union view of human and animal relations.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, did it start out that ambitious, or did you start with maybe like the issue with the Indonesian slaughtering practices?
No,
and
I think this is my really big problem of mine, that I am too ambitious, and I often bite off way more than I can chew. Yeah, it was ambitious from the word go, to the point that it was a bit paralysing sometimes. But like I said before, I don't know, I'm not very good at categorising things. I feel like they're all a bit linked in a Zen-like way. No, do you know what I mean? So there was discussion of putting it solely on Indonesia, but I don't know if people would have wanted to read an entire essay on that. And I think my relationship with animals is not something that's gloomy or cutting edge news or anything. I think there's some charming things that can be written about animals, and I think I like my work to be enjoyable, not just hard-hitting. So it felt like they all sort of worked together and supported each other in a way. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, look, we're getting very precariously close to the end, but we've got time for one more question.
I suppose I'd just like to know because it was such a obviously massive essay and amount of research that you did and everything like that, but on a personal level, and the amount of decisions we make daily, like the conflict we have over what we put in our bodies and what we put in our mouths and what we put on our skin, I was just wondering, from that practical point of view, do you feel like it has made some decisions that would guide your future choices when you are in like the cosmetic department, or when you are, at restaurants? Is it a concern about the welfare practices, or are there hopes that you have there and practical steps that you personally feel like you will take now that have come about from this?
Yeah, well, no, that's how I live. I live like that. Firstly, you'd never see me in a cosmetics department, apart from when I was 15 and I was shoplifting. But that's sort of how I live, and I think it's really tiring. It's exhausting, and I think that's sort of why, again, the debate needs to shift a little for there to be better regulation, because it always comes back to the consumer, and that can be really exhausting. You're looking in the ingredients and you're desperately trying to find palm oil, even though palm oil actually can be called vegetable oil, or it can be called this, or it can just be called a series of numbers. That's really tough for the consumer to have to be constantly on their guard. So, I think these things need to shift into a more of a mainstream understanding, and for regulators to understand that this is not a responsibility that should only fall on consumers. It needs to fall on all of us as a whole in governance as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fantastic hearing you speak, and also reading the essay, which I highly commend to everyone. So please join with me in thanking Anna.